Something happened around 1800 that changed everything. Not gradually, not over centuries, but within a few decades. The giants disappeared. I'm not talking about mythology. I'm not talking about fairy tales or biblical stories. I'm talking about documented, photographed, real human beings who stood 8, 9, sometimes 10 feet tall. People who lived among regular-sized humans, who posed for family portraits, who worked as guards and overseers and administrators. And then after 1800, they simply vanished. As if someone decided they couldn't exist anymore. The official explanation: there never were any giants. Just tricks of photography, medical anomalies, or outright hoaxes. But the evidence tells a different story. A story that connects to something much larger, much more systematic than random genetic mutations. Today we're diving into the Mudflood cover-up. The theory that explains not just where the giants went, but why they had to disappear for the New World Order to take hold. Let me show you something that doesn't fit the official narrative. These photographs from the 1800s show human beings of impossible scale standing next to normal-sized people. Their proportions are perfect, their shadows fall correctly, the grain matches throughout the image. This isn't carnival photography. These are formal portraits, family pictures, official documentation. The kind of photography that would have been expensive, time-consuming, and reserved for important occasions. Look at this image from 1829. Two women, both towering over a group of children. Not one giant, not a medical anomaly, but multiple individuals of extraordinary height photographed together. The children aren't props. They're family members, standing naturally, comfortably, as if this size difference was completely normal. Here's another from 1856. A man easily 9 feet tall standing beside normal-sized companions. His clothing fits perfectly, custom-tailored for his proportions. His posture is confident, authoritative. This isn't someone hiding from society because of a medical condition. This is someone in a position of leadership. And this one from 1850. What you're seeing here challenges everything we've been taught about human history. The giant isn't posed awkwardly or positioned to create an optical illusion. He's simply there, part of the group, part of society. These photographs represent just a fraction of similar images that exist in archives around the world. Always from the same period. Always showing giants integrated into normal society. And always ending abruptly around the 1890s. Why did the giants disappear right when photography was becoming more common? Why don't we have any pictures of them from the 20th century? Where did they go? Here's what the official history won't tell you. The giants didn't gradually die out over centuries. They vanished within a specific time window, roughly 1800 to 1900. Exactly the same period when something else was happening worldwide. Cities were being buried. Not slowly, not through normal geological processes, but rapidly, systematically. Ground floors became basements. Street levels rose 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet. Windows that once opened to roads now open to solid earth. We call it the Mudflood. The theory that a global catastrophe, possibly multiple catastrophes, buried civilization around the world in the 1800s. And when the survivors emerged, when new populations moved into these buried cities, the giants were gone. Look at the timeline. Before 1800, giants appear regularly in historical records, in family portraits, in official documentation. After 1850, they're extinct. Not declining, extinct. The last photographs cluster around the 1870s and 1880s, then nothing. The same period when cities worldwide show evidence of rapid burial. When architectural styles suddenly became uniform across continents. When massive construction projects appeared with impossible speed and suspicious lack of documentation. This isn't coincidence. This is cause and effect. The Mudflood didn't just bury cities. It buried an entire subspecies of humanity. Before we go further, we need to understand what these giants actually were. They weren't monsters, weren't mythological creatures. They were humans, just significantly larger than the rest of us. But look at their role in society. In photograph after photograph, they appear in positions of authority. Standing behind normal-sized people in protective stances. Wearing official uniforms or formal clothing suggesting important positions. Many of these images show giants in front of massive buildings. Buildings with doorways that seem absurdly oversized for normal humans, but perfectly proportioned for 9-foot-tall people. Buildings we've been told were designed for grandeur or intimidation. What if those buildings weren't built by the civilizations we credit them to? What if they were built for the giants, by the giants? What if the oversized architecture we see worldwide isn't decorative excess, but functional design for a larger subspecies of humanity? This would explain the construction mystery. How were massive stone structures built with such precision in the 1700s and 1800s? Maybe they weren't built then. Maybe they already existed, built by and for a race of humans who could move stones, operate machinery, and oversee construction at scales we consider impossible. The giants weren't rulers. They were administrators, the guardian class of a previous civilization. And when that civilization ended, when the mudflood buried their cities, the new inhabitants had to figure out what to do with buildings designed for 9-foot-tall people. Here's where the cover-up begins. If you're inheriting cities you didn't build, using architecture designed for people twice your size, what do? You create new narratives. You claim the buildings as your own. You backdate the construction, invent the architects, and remove any evidence that suggests someone else was there first. But what about the giants themselves? The living proof that the previous civilization employed people of extraordinary size. That becomes a problem. Not just a construction problem or a historical problem, but a legitimacy problem. How do you claim to be the rightful inheritors of these cities when there are still people around who remember building them? People whose very existence proves your narrative is false. The solution was systematic. Not genocide, not mass murder, but careful marginalization followed by institutional erasure. The giants were gradually pushed to the edges of society, their roles diminished, their authority questioned. By the 1850s and 1860s, as photography became more common, the giants began appearing less frequently in official contexts. More often, they're photographed as curiosities, as unusual individuals rather than authority figures. And by the 1890s, they're gone entirely. Not dead, necessarily, but removed from public life so thoroughly that their absence becomes the new normal. But the concealment alone doesn't explain the complete disappearance. For that, we need to understand what the mudflood actually was. Not just a natural disaster, but a reset event that changed the fundamental structure of civilization. The evidence suggests that between 1800 and 1850, a series of catastrophic events buried cities worldwide under feet of mud, debris, and earth. Not gradually, but rapidly enough that ground floors became basements almost overnight. These weren't local floods or isolated disasters. The architectural evidence shows the same burial pattern from St. Petersburg to San Francisco, from London to Melbourne. The same raised street levels, the same buried first floors, the same impossible uniformity of disruption. Whatever caused the mudflood was global in scope and devastating in impact. And when it ended, when the survivors began digging out, the population structure had changed completely. The giants, who may have been the administrative class of the pre-mudflood civilization, were either killed in the catastrophe or displaced so thoroughly that they couldn't maintain their social positions. The new populations, the post-mudflood survivors, had no use for administrators of a buried civilization. This explains not just the disappearance of the giants, but the sudden appearance of uniform architecture worldwide. The new inhabitants weren't building these massive structures. They were uncovering them, claiming them, and creating foundation myths to explain how they'd accomplished such impossible construction projects. Once the giants were gone, their existence became inconvenient for the new historical narrative. Academic institutions, museums, and government agencies faced a choice. Acknowledge that a previous civilization had employed people of extraordinary size, or quietly erase the evidence. They chose erasure, not active destruction, but passive neglect. Giant skeletons discovered in archaeological digs were archived in ways that made them difficult to access. Photographs showing giants in official contexts were categorized as curiosities or misfiled in collections where researchers wouldn't easily find them. The newspaper reports stopped. The scientific interest disappeared. The questions simply weren't asked anymore because asking them led to answers that didn't fit the preferred narrative of gradual human progress and technological advancement. By the early 1900s, the institutional consensus was complete. Giants had never existed as a distinct population. Any evidence suggesting otherwise was dismissed as medical anomalies, photographic tricks, or frontier exaggeration. The cover-up wasn't a conspiracy. It was the natural result of institutions protecting a narrative that served their interests. A narrative where the massive architecture of the 1800s represented rapid human progress rather than inheritance from a previous civilization. Look at the buildings constructed during the period when giants disappear. Massive stone structures with impossible timelines, uniform architectural styles appearing simultaneously across continents, and construction techniques that allegedly surpassed anything built before or since. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Official history claims it was built in 2 years with 19th century technology. Temporary structures so magnificent they inspired a new architectural movement. But there are almost no photographs of the construction process, no adequate records of the labor force required, no documentation of where the millions of cubic feet of building materials came from. What if it wasn't built? What if it was uncovered, restored, and temporarily repurposed? What if the temporary designation was a way to explain why these incredible structures were later demolished rather than preserved? The same pattern repeats worldwide. San Francisco's massive civic buildings appearing with impossible speed after the gold rush. Melbourne's exhibition halls rivaling European cathedrals despite being a colonial outpost. St. Petersburg's palaces constructed during periods when Russia was supposedly struggling with basic infrastructure. All of these structures share common architectural elements that suggest centralized planning or common inheritance. They feature the same oversized proportions, the same sophisticated engineering, the same mathematical principles governing their spatial relationships, and all appear during the exact period when giants vanish from the photographic record. Almost as if the two phenomena were connected. As if the buildings were designed for the giants, and when the giants disappeared, new populations inherited structures they couldn't properly use or understand. Imagine you're part of the post-Mudflood population. You've inherited massive cities with architecture scaled for people twice your size. The previous inhabitants, the giants who could actually use these buildings properly, are gone. Dead, displaced, or hidden away where they can't contradict your claims. What do? You can't admit you didn't build these incredible structures. That would undermine your legitimacy as the rightful inhabitants. You can't acknowledge that a previous civilization might have been more advanced than yours. That would raise uncomfortable questions about progress and superiority. So you create new histories. You claim rapid construction using primitive tools and unlimited manpower. You invent architectural movements that explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated building techniques. You establish museums and academic institutions that support these narratives and discourage alternative explanations. Most importantly, you eliminate evidence of the previous inhabitants. Not through violence necessarily, but through systematic exclusion from public life, from historical records, from institutional memory. The giants become a non-topic, not debated, not studied, not acknowledged, simply absent from the official story of human development. But photographs don't lie the way written records can lie. And the photographic evidence from the 1800s preserves what the official histories tried to erase. Real people of extraordinary size living normal lives in the decades immediately following the Mudflood. Look at these images again. The giants aren't positioned as freaks or curiosities. They're photographed as family members, as colleagues, as authority figures. Their clothing is expensive. They're bearing confident. These are people who held important positions in society. And notice the buildings behind them. Massive structures with the same oversized proportions we see in newly constructed civic buildings from the same period. Architecture that makes perfect sense if you assume it was designed for 9-foot-tall people. The giants weren't museum pieces. They were the last remnants of the pre-Mudflood civilization, possibly the only ones who really understood how the inherited architecture was supposed to function. That's what made them dangerous to the new narrative. They were living proof that the massive buildings weren't recent construction projects, but inherited infrastructure from a previous era. Here's something that doesn't make sense in the official timeline. After 1850, the rate of giant disappearance accelerates dramatically. Not a gradual decline over generations, but an abrupt vanishing within a few decades. The last reliable photographs cluster around the 1870s and 1880s. By 1900, they're completely absent from public life. That's not enough time for a population to die out naturally, even a small one. Something happened between 1850 and 1890 that completed the removal process. Whether the remaining giants were relocated, institutionalized, or eliminated, the evidence suggests a coordinated effort to finalize their disappearance from society. This coincides with the period when the Mudflood cleanup was largely complete, when the inherited cities had been fully claimed by new populations, when the construction narratives had been established and the institutional consensus had solidified. The giants were no longer needed as administrators of a buried civilization, and they had become inconvenient as witnesses to the true history of the post-Mudflood world. One aspect of this cover-up that official history can't adequately explain is the coordination. How did populations across different continents, different cultures, different political systems all arrive at the same solution to the giant problem? Russian expansion into Siberia, European colonialism in America and Australia, Chinese territorial consolidation, American westward movement. All of these involved claiming territories that showed evidence of previous habitation by people of extraordinary size, and all resulted in the same response. The giants were marginalized, then eliminated from public life. The inherited architecture was attributed to rapid construction by the new inhabitants. The photographic evidence was archived rather than displayed. This suggests something more systematic than independent cultural evolution. Either there was actual coordination between these expanding powers, or they were all following a common template for managing the inheritance of Mudflood ruins. Either way, it implies that the giant disappearance was intentional, not accidental. a deliberate choice made by institutions that understood the threat posed by living evidence of the previous civilization. Today, mainstream archaeology and anthropology don't debate the existence of giants in recent history. They dismiss the entire category of evidence without serious examination. Not because the evidence is weak, but because acknowledging it would require rewriting fundamental assumptions about human development. Museum collections contain hundreds of photographs showing giants integrated into 19th century society. But these images aren't displayed. They're archived in ways that make them difficult for researchers to access, labeled as curiosities or examples of primitive photography rather than historical documentation. Academic institutions don't fund research into giant populations. Grant proposals investigating the connection between oversized architecture and human subspecies are rejected before peer review. The questions simply aren't considered legitimate areas of scholarly inquiry. This isn't active suppression in the traditional sense. It's institutional inertia. The educational system has been built around narratives that can't accommodate evidence of recent giant populations, so that evidence becomes invisible. Students learn about rapid 19th century construction without questioning how such massive projects were completed with primitive technology. They accept uniform architectural styles appearing simultaneously across continents without wondering about coordination or common inheritance. The giants have been so thoroughly erased that most people don't even know to ask why buildings from that period seem scaled for much larger humans. But the buildings remember, even if we don't. Walk through any major city and you'll see the evidence. Government buildings with 15-foot ceilings and working corridors. Doorways so tall that normal people feel dwarfed. Staircases with risers requiring uncomfortable stretches. These aren't decorative choices. They're functional elements designed for people who needed that extra space, who used those proportions naturally. Look at the 1800s furniture in museum collections. Chairs with seat heights of 30 inches, rather than the standard 18. Desks scaled for people who would tower over modern users. Beds that are not just long but proportionally oversized in every dimension. This furniture wasn't made for giants because they were special or different. It was made for giants because they were normal users of the inherited infrastructure. The administrators and overseers who actually knew how the pre-Mudflood buildings were supposed to function. When the giants disappeared, their furniture became curiosities. Their architecture became monuments to rapid human progress. Their very existence became impossible to acknowledge without undermining the entire post-Mudflood historical narrative. I can't prove definitively what happened to the giants after 1800. The evidence has been too thoroughly scattered, archived, and marginalized for clear conclusions. But I can ask questions. Why do photographs from the 1800s regularly show people of extraordinary size in positions of authority? Why does this photographic evidence stop abruptly around 1890? Why does the architecture from this period seem designed for much larger humans? Why don't modern academic institutions study these photographs seriously? Why is there no genetic research into recent giant populations? Why does mentioning this evidence immediately invite dismissal rather than investigation? And why does the timeline of giant disappearance coincide so precisely with the Mudflood period? Why do both phenomena cluster in the same decades, affecting the same geographical regions? Most importantly, if the Mudflood theory is correct, if a global catastrophe reset civilization around 1800, what happened to the survivors of the previous world? Did they die in the catastrophe? Were they absorbed into new populations? Or were they systematically removed because their existence threatened the legitimacy of the inheritors? The giants weren't just tall people. They were the last connection to whatever came before. Living proof that the massive infrastructure of the 1800s wasn't newly built, but newly claimed. And that's a truth that couldn't be allowed to survive in the post-Mudflood world. The cover-up wasn't perfect because it couldn't be perfect. You can erase people from institutional records, but you can't erase buildings. You can marginalize photographic evidence, but you can't make it disappear entirely. The proof is still there. Waiting in museum archives, in private collections, in the architectural proportions of buildings we walk through daily without questioning their scale. Every oversized doorway is evidence. Every impossibly high ceiling in a government corridor. Every piece of 1800s furniture that seems designed for people who no longer exist. The giants didn't vanish because of natural selection or genetic drift. They disappeared because their existence became inconvenient for populations claiming to have built a world they had actually inherited. The Mudflood buried their cities. The cover-up buried their memory. But the evidence remains, preserved in stone and silver, waiting for someone willing to ask the questions everyone else has agreed not to ask. Why did giants vanish after 1800? Because they were the last witnesses to what came before. And witnesses can't be allowed when the entire legitimacy of the current world depends on forgetting what it replaced. The answer isn't in the biology textbooks or the archaeology journals. It's in the photographs they don't display, in the buildings scaled for people who officially never existed, in the systematic silence surrounding evidence that would change everything we think we know about recent history. They didn't just erase the giants from the history books. They erased them from the world. And we've been living in that erasure ever since, walking through their buildings, using their infrastructure, following maps redrawn to hide their territories. But the truth doesn't disappear just because it becomes inconvenient. It waits. In every photograph showing impossible human proportions, in every building designed for people twice our size, in every question we're not supposed to ask about the world we inherited, the giants didn't vanish. They were vanished. And once you see the difference, you can't unsee what that means about everything else we've been told about our recent past.